World building a setting is fun. Playing D&D is fun. But sometimes turning the cool world that you have come up with into a game that is fun for your players is easier said than done. Now, if you're like me, your D&D notes are a jumble of maps, diagrams, and short descriptions. You know what that sounds like? An encyclopedia. When players sit down at your table, they are expecting a game, not a session of you reading encyclopedia entries to them. So how do we bridge the gap between our lore and a fun, interactive gaming experience? If you are writing a fantasy novel and you want to make the lore of your world interesting, a good way to do that is to make it important to your characters. There are a lot of ways to do this in writing and a million videos on each. Stuff like exposition, show don't tell, and other things of that nature. I think that a lot of these strategies are important and worthwhile for us to learn about as DMs, but there's an added dimension to our job when we are writing or running an adventure, and one that makes it all the more fun. We don't control the characters. I think it holds true at the table that important lore is interesting and interesting lore is important, but our added challenge as a DM is establishing that feeling with our players, and by extension, their characters. A thought process I use to help me with this is a mental tree diagram. To any CS, set theory, or cladistics nerds out there, I know I'm breaking a few rules here, but hierarchical, otherwise non-arboreal diagram didn't really have the same ring to it. In our tree, each circle or node depicts one bit of information, or a 3 to 8 word statement of some fact. A node's level depicts how deep or esoteric that bit of information is, meaning, operatively, the further down the tree you go, the fewer people know it. And finally, siblings are bits of information that are in the same realm of understanding, so a person who knows one sibling could reasonably know another. To be clear, I don't have a physical copy of this diagram that I use when I'm taking notes, and I don't think it's necessary for you to either. If you use something like OneNote or Obsidian to take all of your notes, you might have something pretty close to this already, but I'm old-fashioned and I use mostly paper for my note-taking. But I employ the tree diagram as a mental model, and that's how it's useful to me, as a way to frame my thoughts. This structure helps me turn a couple of maps and some descriptions into the setting of a grand adventure. First, let's go over how it works. On the tree diagram of lore, there are 2 rules. The first rule is you usually want to add only one node or bit of information at a time, meaning there should be gameplay between each step. That gameplay can be pretty short, something like an intelligence check or a trip to the town's library, but the characters should be doing something. Rule 2 is the players take the steps. If we are successful as DMs, certain avenues on your tree will be interesting or promising enough for your players to want to continue down them. More on that later. Now, what does the diagram do for us? These rules can help prevent some temptations that we might have as the world builders of our setting. If we go one level of information at a time, that prevents us from info dumping onto our players. Being excited about your world and its lore is a good thing, but one thing we want to avoid as DMs is that feeling I mentioned of reading an encyclopedia to your players. The tree diagram helps us to remember to go one step at a time, either horizontal or vertical, and then get back to gameplay. If we keep to the tree diagram rules in our game, our players can feel empowered and motivated to go seek out lore and information themselves, as opposed to us offering it to them as a plot token. This, in my experience, is a pretty good way of getting your players involved in the world around their characters, because it allows them to pursue what they find interesting. The step-by-step nature of the tree diagram also builds mystery as your players explore its deeper levels. It is in this way that the diagram turns our encyclopedia into gameplay, in the form of a quest or a character arc. Let's think about a basic character arc adaptable to any medium. A character investigates the inner workings of something in their background. they are confronted with an unexpected truth. They either accept or reject this new truth, but regardless of their decision, they are changed by the process. Let's take another look, this time with our DM lens on. Your player is traveling down the tree diagram of their background. Well, would you look at that? Some lore has made its way in there. Not only are they interacting with the world is interacting with them. And finally, after some personal conflict, your player feels that their character is now dynamic and maybe a little more interesting, which they probably are. Okay, so how do we use everything we've talked about? It's fun to think about these kinds of general ideas, but one thing that I have found lacking in some D&D advice videos, and something that I want to include in all of my videos, is what that advice looks like in practice. First, I think it is important to quickly establish that these are fruitful waters, that the deeper levels of the information tree promise incredible and interesting loot or abilities. A common example of this is the legend of the magical artifact. Everybody loves a Grail quest. So don't be afraid to give one to your players. Let's say you're writing your adventure and you roll on the world-shaking events table, and you get a 5, meaning a rebellion, a revolution, or an overthrowing. Now that you have an event that is pivotal to the central tension of the adventure, a great way to introduce it to your players is through the legend of a lost artifact. The King's Emerald Crown, stolen during a midnight coup d'etat, or a divine relic used by a folk hero to battle the forces of death itself. You are giving lore to your players, but in the same breath you are giving them the promise of a powerful magical item. A Grail quest can be a quick and easy way to establish that there is a bite behind your lore's bark. One variation I've had a lot of luck with is the accidental Grail acquisition, where the players stumble upon some incredibly powerful item, but for one reason or another they can't fully utilize it. For example, in my previous adventure, one of my players noticed that there were a bunch of magical barriers in place on the top floor of one of the palace's towers. He was able to do some rogue things and make it inside. It took a good deal of session time, but it was a ton of fun. Turns out what they were guarding was a writing quill made entirely of ice, which turned out to be the holy relic of the goddess of winter, and one of the 21 most important magical artifacts on the continent. But the way I've made relics work in my game is that they have 3 levels of effectiveness. The higher 2 are only available to individuals who have a large amount of favor with the associated deity. Now, my goddess of winter bestows favor upon those who strategize, stick to the plan, and who are cold and calculating. Suffice to say, my player's party doesn't have a great deal of favor with this particular goddess. So all my players have access to is the quill's basic effect, which in game terms is being able to cast commune at will with the aforementioned goddess. This is a pretty strong effect to give to a level 6 party, but it's certainly not artifact level. Which brings me to my second suggestion if you want to try this accidental Grail acquisition strategy. Make the item hot, meaning if word got out that the players had it, droves of enemies would show up looking for it. Now, one of my players is a multi-class artificer and paladin who rolls like a 50 on all of his religion checks, so the party got a good deal of information about this relic. But this is a famous item. Even with a low roll, I would have impressed on them 2 things. 1, the previous owners are almost certainly going to come looking for it. And 2, there is a pretty decent chance that any intelligent individual who sees this thing will immediately know what it is. Understanding this risk, they try not to use it too much, and if they have to talk about it to each other in public, they call it the chicken, just to avoid calling it by name. I've also had a decent amount of luck making the item symbolic on top of useful. Now, like the quill, it should probably have some usefulness, like a niche rare level effect, but its true power resides in the influence it holds over people. Many wars have been fought over holy relics in my setting, and many dynasties have started simply because someone possesses one. So we want to quickly establish with our players that traveling along the tree diagram can reward them with loot and abilities. We should also travel down the levels of the tree diagram quickly and easily, while making sure that the players are active in pursuing that information. We can facilitate this by making sure that every node in the information tree contains the promise or a hint about the next level down or across. To illustrate this, let's take a look at a common occurrence early in an adventure. The players have just gotten to a city and they want to know the rundown. The first step is usually history checks, or if one of the players is from the surrounding area, they will ask, "What do I know about the city?" Meaning their characters aren't doing anything active, they're simply trying to remember things. They want to exchange an intelligence check of some value for a commensurate amount of information. In this situation, I'm of the opinion you should only give them 1 or 2 pieces of information on the tree. If they roll a 9 to a 14, give them 1 piece of information, and a 15 or higher is 2. This is one of the few times I would give 2 pieces of information at the same time, only because it's at the very beginning of an adventure. For example, my players got to a quarantined capital city. They needed to make contact with a secretive informant, but before going into the city, they wanted the lay of the land. With their first round of checks, I let them know that the city, called Steel Point, was a maritime trade hub known for its exports of fine rum. I also let them know that the city's economy depends on trade. Now, what information have I given them? The reason the city is big and that it is quarantined. A small amount of dot connecting, and the players should be able to realize that something is terribly wrong. If a city relies on trade and it is not letting ships in or out, there's probably a pretty good reason. There probably shouldn't, in my opinion, be that big of a jump between those first bits of information you give and the content you have prepared. At this point, if I've done my job, my players are thinking, there is a widespread problem in this city, and we are probably going to have to wade through it to find our informant. Now, when they're done with history checks, next step is usually hitting the pavement. When your players realize they've gotten everything they're going to get from you with intelligence checks, they will tend to start asking around. If they follow the well-known D&D trope, they might go to a tavern. Taverns are great because you can put whoever you want there. Short of maybe the Emperor, there is a relatively defensible reason for any NPC to be in any given tavern. That means that any quest giver, plot mover, or villain you'd like to introduce is, well, you look at that. They're in the same tavern as the party. Say they kick the trope, don't go to the tavern, and start asking around town. This step is great because it allows for one of the many instances of what I'll call DM sleight of hand. Every single NPC your players come across is useful. They are not necessarily knowledgeable or helpful, but they are never a waste of time. For example, my players asked the dock foreman why the city was in quarantine. His response was, "Well, I'm not one to get into politics." On the surface, he seems like just another uncooperative NPC, but what has he told the players? The quarantine is, or at least perceived as, political, and the party will almost certainly be getting involved in politics. Also, your players have been told where to go. If the dock foreman, who is not a nobody, thinks it's above his pay grade to talk about, your players are probably not going to talk to a farmer in the poor district. They probably know that they need to go to a higher social strata in the rich district so they can talk to the politicians and the royal family. Or, if your party is a little less than savory, they might head right to the pits of the city, get in contact with the Thieves Guild, and work out a deal so they can get into the palace. Now, the goal of DM sleight of hand like this is not to give our players the illusion of choice where all avenues end in the same outcome, but to make sure that they are encouraged to stay within the confines of the content we have prepared. This might take a bit of practice and a little nuance, but with this strategy, you can make pretty much any NPC tell the party anything without speaking out of character. If we use this DM trick well, we can help our players always feel like they know where they want to go next. While using the tree during your sessions, pay attention to which avenues of information your players travel down more readily or excitedly. Then use those to influence your deep lore writing time. If one or more of your players seem interested in a particular part of your world, they are never wrong. Even if you didn't have a ton of initial interest in fleshing out what they are investigating, I've found that I can develop that interest pretty easily just by writing. Say one of my players' characters shows a large amount of interest in merfolk lore and culture, but the only thing I knew about merfolk in my setting at that point was that I rolled their stat block on a random coastal encounter. During my next session of deep lore writing, I would probably read the monster manual blurb on merfolk and start thinking. Well, it makes sense to me that merfolk are ancestral to the plane of water. Well, okay, where's the water planar gate in my setting? Well, if that's where they irradiated from, then it makes sense that the surrounding cultures of that particular area would have some mer influence. And then in turn, it makes sense that those cultures would have influenced the merfolk as they were radiating out. Pretty soon, I have a real-world language analog for mer speech, a regional power structure of underwater clans, and I'm so excited about merfolk in general that I want to start rolling magic items that have been grown out of coral. Now, unlike most of my examples, this is not something that happened in one of my games. I did this just now in 5 minutes of thinking and 5 minutes of writing, just to demonstrate how quickly these things can start to come together. Your thought process isn't going to be exactly like mine, but once I start thinking about what my players have expressed interest in, I've found it pretty easy to become interested myself. And once you're interested in something, the writing tends to happen pretty quickly. And finally, have future problems in your game refer to or be solvable by things that your players have learned or acquired through the lore tree. I like to think that anything that my players spend any meaningful amount of in-game time doing will eventually become important, or at least helpful. First, let's talk about making something important. Meaning, this particular journey on the lore tree is going to help them either understand or interact with the A-plot. For example, one PC who used to own a tea shop has asked about and experimented with making magically infused teas 8 or 9 times during the adventure. When I want to lend some importance to a particular line of investigation, sometimes I will introduce a microcosm of the inciting event, or that thing that happened before the adventure that causes the A-plot, and something the PCs will have to confront eventually. Say the aforementioned tea maker brews some magically infused tea with ebony leaf and maple bark, but it doesn't work. Or, a personal favorite strategy of mine, it works too well. Immediately after drinking it, a small black pentagram appears on the ground. Some swirling black and red energy eventually coalesces into a tiny, skeletal, desiccated, but still somehow kind of cute, baby bird. Now my PC has an undead hatchling following him around. If they were to do a little bit of research and experimentation, they might realize that the shamanistic attributes associated with ebony and maple are, respectively, necrotic, meaning death and nastiness, and binding, meaning interacting with interplanar beings. Another step down the information tree, and they might realize that by combining these two attributes, one could summon an extraplanar undead creature. Then, if your players visit the mayor's house and see that he has a giant maple and ebony hybrid tree in his front yard, congratulations, we have followed the information tree, pardon the pun, all the way back to the A-plot. Let's try option 2, or making something helpful. Say you can't figure out a way for your players' investigations to fit quite as neatly into the content you have prepared. I would impress on the player so they understood that they have found something useful, but I would not give them any hints on how to utilize it. If you have done your job and they were listening, in the next few sessions you might hear, "Hey, can I use that thing to do the thing?" If their solution makes sense to you, then yeah, absolutely, that sounds like it should work. If it's a touch too far, then I like to lean on the one more step method. This materializes in yes, but statements, relevant MCDM in the description. Yes, that sounds like it should work, but it's going to have to steep overnight. But you're probably going to have to get some botanical information from the library. But you're going to have to boil it over elemental fire. When we use a language like this with our players, we are communicating to them that they have already completed 7 out of 8 steps, which, if you think about the tree diagram, they probably have. This is a much more encouraging position for them to be in than floundering around just hoping something works. Also, when I employ the one more step strategy, I try and be very clear in what they need to do. There are many times for ambiguity when you are running, but I don't think this is one of them. Some clarity about that final step can really light a fire under your player to actively pursue it. Say you start using a mental tree diagram when introducing lore in your game. You follow the rules and employ the strategies I talked about. How do we know it's working? A good sign is when you notice your players start putting things together for themselves, as opposed to immediately asking you if they can make an intelligence check. One thing we're looking for is the, "Oh, yo, is that the thing?" And then they start flipping through their notes. Also acceptable is a player who has been silent for a few minutes and then says, guys? All in all, just remember, it is fun to put things together, it's fun to solve puzzles, and it's fun to solve mysteries. It's less fun to listen to someone read an encyclopedia. We are game designers just as much as we are world builders. When we establish for our players that the world around their characters is worth exploring, they will start traveling along the tree diagram all by themselves. Building a world and writing an adventure are fun endeavors. A mental tree diagram can help us temper our excitement about our own lore just enough to make sure our players are our collaborators and not just along for the ride. Thanks for watching, everybody. That is the video on mental tree diagrams. Remember, there is not one correct way to DM, and there's not one correct way to think about DMing. This is just something that has helped me over the years. If you want to support me, you can do all the normal stuff down here, or you can head over to the DMs Guild and check out Principles of Shamanism. Later.